So there are many people who say, Jesus was poor. I want to be like Jesus. Therefore, I want to be poor. And I think this myth that Jesus was a millionaire has come up to try to contradict that and to try and say, no, you don't have to be poor to be like Jesus. You can be wealthy and be like Jesus too, which is true. Welcome to the My 2 Cents podcast, where we explore the financial things that many of us never learned in church. Every week, we'll dive into what Scripture says about work, saving, investing, debt, generosity, stewardship, and everything in between. Not to build bigger bank accounts, but to build hearts that trust God more fully. I'm Sarah Grown, and these are My 2 Cents. All right, welcome back. I feel like we're on episode 9, just trucking right along here. This one is going to be fun. Today we're talking about, was Jesus a millionaire? Now, depending on what circle of Christianity you have grown up in, this might be something that you've heard a lot of and is just like, sure, yeah, why not? Like, it doesn't even matter. Or it could be something you have never even heard before. That's a myth. I've literally never heard that. Jesus was poor. Of course he was poor. Why would anyone believe that? And so we are going to look into the myth, figure out where it came from. We're going to honestly only talk about one or two of the arguments for it because I just don't think we have time to dive into all the nitty-gritty details, but we're going to look at why people believe that, what is it true, is it not true, bring it back to the Bible, test it for truth, and then come to our conclusion, just like normal, right? Okay, so let's get going. To start off, this myth does not just come from a misinterpreted verse or a little misunderstanding of the Bible. Sometimes we can get impressions from the Bible. This does not come from there, which makes it a little bit different than the last couple myths that we have looked at. But this one comes from, mainly historians attribute the widespread of it to someone named John Avazzini. I could be totally butchering his last name. I'm not totally sure. But John Avazzini is the one who, even though if he didn't come up with the myth himself, he spread it through his books. And a lot of his books circulated in a lot of word of faith and prosperity gospel circles. And from there, spread into other denominations that may be more closely associated with word of faith circles. And then from social media over the last 10 years, it's circulated even farther than that. So if you're in a very conservative circle, you may have never heard this. If you're on social media within the Christian financial niche, you likely have heard rumor of this. If you're in more Pentecostal circles, it's possible you have heard this. And so we're going to just look at where that came from. Like, where did he come up with that idea? So he has a couple books about this, I believe. I haven't read them myself, but I have researched the arguments around this pretty extensively. And some of the arguments that come up are that the Magi gave very generous gifts. When the Magi came, gold, frankincense, and myrrh are worth a lot of money. And so that was enough to give them millionaire status. Another thing is that when Jesus died, he had a seamless tunic, that Jesus had a financial keeper. Judas was the person who managed the money bag. And so in order to have a financial secretary like that, you must have had a decent amount of money to handle. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been need for that. Furthermore, he had wealthy women investing into his ministry. And there's a few other ones that are smaller, but the main one that actually holds weight is the one that we're going to look at today, and that's the Magi's gifts. The other ones can pretty easily be explained, and I did go over that in my blog. I'll include my blog in the show notes where I actually talk a little bit more into details of ancient currency conversion and how you actually are supposed to use bread for that. Most historians convert using loaves of bread, not actual dollars, because it is just so incredibly hard to convert ancient currency into today's currency and the buying power of that. And then I go into all the arguments and just talk about that. But the main one we're going to focus in on today is the Magi's gifts, because that one just holds the majority of the weight of the argument. And so no matter where you are, I would really ask you to be aware of your biases when we're looking through any of these MythBusters, honestly. I think I've maybe mentioned this in the past, but when we're aware of our biases, we're able to say, okay, I am like bent towards believing one thing or the other. I'm bent towards believing that Jesus was a millionaire, or I'm bent towards believing that he was poor. But I'm going to step outside of my biases because I want to believe what's true. And that is just like a human psychology thing, is that our brain, one of the protection factors it has is that it's going to try and protect what we already believe is true. And that can work for us and it can work against us. So let's set our biases aside and just say, all right, is it true? Because maybe there's value in Jesus being a millionaire. Let's look at it. Let's just look at it. Okay. So we're going to jump into the Magi's gifts. The Magi's gifts, obviously, are talked about in the Gospels, and they're brought to Jesus probably around 2 years after he was born. That's what generally theologians believe, is it was about 2 years after he was born when the Magi brought him their gifts. Now, it is very important to note that there is nothing that says anything about the quantity or the quality, the weights or the measures of any of these gifts. It only points out that they were gold, they were frankincense, and they were myrrh. And so everything that we say about the quantity, the quality, the weights, and the measures of these gifts is speculative. Whether we say it was just a little trinket or we say it was a whole caravan worth of stuff, it is completely speculative. We're just trying to look at stuff outside of the Bible to figure it out, because the Bible never tells us. And so that is an important just note to make. The Bible never tells us. So looking back at early church history, I like to look at church history. Most of the church fathers really spent most of their time emphasizing the symbolism of the gifts. Now, if you have been around any Christian circle, I sure hope you have heard about the symbolism of the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. If not, go research that, because it is just incredibly interesting and beautiful. In fact, my pastor a couple Christmases ago did a sermon on this that was beautiful. I'll link it in the show notes. Okay, anyways, so for church history, that's really been the emphasis. It's not how much it was worth, like how much money they were getting, how much wealth it was getting. It was always revolved around just their symbolism. And so people looked at them as if they were more of like a trinket than giving them a lot of wealth. Now, in 2017, so not that long ago, I know it's like 10 years ago, but that is very late when you're looking at church history, a Catholic scholar by the name of David Longenbecker wrote a book called The Mystery of the Magi. And he was not at all trying to make any kind of claim that Jesus grew up wealthy. All he was doing in that book was just simply trying to figure out who the Magi were, where they came from, why they were significant in Jesus' story. And in that journey of looking through and trying to figure out who they were, one of the conclusions that he came to was that they likely brought a whole caravan of incredible value to Jesus. It was not just a small trinket. It was a whole caravan of incredible value. So that is one of the strongest cases for people who do believe that Jesus was a millionaire. It is possible that these dignitaries from other countries did bring great wealth. Like they wouldn't have traveled that distance with just a trinket. Now, there's a lot of scholars that land in the middle. N.T. Wright, Craig Bloomberg, the renowned New Testament scholar who has really very extensively written about wealth and possessions in the Bible. He's known for that. And others like Raymond Brown, they really fall in a middle ground position as far as the wealth of these go. So what they believe is that it was likely significant value, but it was enough that it was portable. So it was enough that it provided provision for Mary and Joseph in a way that they could conceal. As a young family, you have to remember, Mary and Joseph were likely in their late teens at this point. They were just like kids, guys. They were kids, and they could have been taken advantage of very easily on their trip to Egypt, because they had to flee to Egypt right after these gifts were given them, right? And so they would have needed to either round up protection, camels, all the different things they would have needed to make this trek into the desert safely, or they would have had to have a way to conceal that wealth, which if they had a small trunk, it would have been still a significant value, but enough that they could sew gold into the edges of their garments and easily stuff into the rest of their belongings, whether they went out and bought a camel or had a donkey. We don't really know. Like I've said, everything's speculative, but a lot of New Testament scholars kind of land in this middle position that it was a significant value, but it was enough that they could carry it discreetly for safety. I think it was like around 2 years is their guesstimate of how long they lived in Egypt, and then head back and reestablish themselves years later when they came back. And so they would have needed provision to do that, especially as just a young couple. I don't know if any of you guys remember those young years when you're first having kids and you're first trying to establish yourself. Those are financially really hard years. And I don't think it was any different back in ancient times, that they're just hard years when you're just starting a family and getting going. And I do believe it was slightly different because there was more of a family unit back then with extended family and whatnot. But I still think it was hard. I still think it was hard. And I don't think that was an exception for Mary and Joseph and needing to flee into Egypt and all that kind of stuff. Needless to say, even if they had gotten back in and established themselves, they probably still had some left that would sustain them for a few years. But they didn't have investments they could have put that into to make it be like income for life for them. And so likely by the time Jesus was 30, those reserves had been spent. That position makes a lot of sense to me. It seems to align well with a lot of different things, but let's keep digging in case we've missed something, right? So let's look at Jesus's actual ministry, because what we're saying now is not that Joseph and Mary handled these finances, because really, while he was a child, they may have been given to Jesus because he was king, but obviously a 2-year-old is not going to handle this kind of finances, right? So Mary and Joseph were the ones in charge of handling it and spending it and utilizing it. So now we're gotten to a point where Jesus is grown, and is there enough that it is now handed over to him? When does that happen? We don't really know. But if we are to speculate that Jesus was a millionaire as an adult, then we're speculating that he had hidden wealth. When we look at the Bible, it seems to say the opposite, actually, like the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Peter came to him and was like, hey, we need to pay the temple tax. And he didn't say, oh, okay, that's fine. I'll just get some money and I'll pay the temple tax. He said, okay, go fish and get a temple tax. Like, it feels like he's saying, I don't want to spend my own money that I have stockpiled back at home, or that I actually just want to fish and get it. I'll leave my stockpile alone. And it's the same with feeding the 5,000. They were like, it would take a man like a year's wages to feed all these people. How are we going to feed all these people? And Jesus was sitting on a year's wages or more, and just chose to ask God for miraculous provision instead of spending the provision he already had. And telling a rich young ruler, go and sell all you have and give to the poor, while he's sitting on a stockpile at home. Like, it just doesn't work well with the narrative of the gospel to believe that Jesus was a secret millionaire. That's one of the biggest reasons that I personally don't think it's worth believing Jesus was a millionaire, because the truth of the matter is the Gospels don't seem to say that. And the Bible is not afraid of telling you when people are wealthy. The Bible flat out tells you that Abraham was wealthy, that Solomon was wealthy, that Job was wealthy, that Joseph of Arimathea was wealthy. And so why would it do that and then want to keep Jesus's wealth a secret? Be generous, depend on the Lord, but keep a whole bunch of wealth a secret. That doesn't make sense to me. Now, the rest of the arguments, like I said, you can find them all on my blog. The seamless tunic, just to go over it real quick, when you look into a seamless tunic, it actually wasn't worth that much more than a regular tunic. It was nice. It was like saying you're not buying Walmart jeans, you're buying silver jeans. And so, yes, it was worth more, but it wasn't millionaire status worth more. And it very easily could have been given to him as a gift. A seamless tunic would have been more durable, and it would have made a lot of sense for him to wear something like that in his long journeys. Judas being the financial keeper, as someone who works with small business owners and does a little bit of my own small business stuff, I know that even when I have very little, I keep track. And especially when you have one amount of money for a whole ministry, whether it's a little or a lot, you manage it responsibly. And so I don't think that actually says that he had a ton of wealth, that he had someone managing it. That's just something that needs to be managed, whether the bag is nearly empty or very full. And I'm sure during times of their ministry, there was different times where it was mostly empty or very full, because that's just how life goes. So that doesn't really prove a point at all. It's all just speculation. Okay, with that all said, why does this matter? And I think this is where I really want to land this whole argument. Why does this matter? And the reason that this matters is because a lot of times the reason that this myth that Jesus was a millionaire comes to try to undo that Jesus was poor. Now, both of them are kind of speculation. We really don't know Jesus's exact financial status at every moment in time in his life. But the problem is that we see a financial status and we think that's the goal. So there are many people who say, Jesus was poor, I want to be like Jesus, therefore I want to be poor. And I think this myth that Jesus was a millionaire has come up to try to contradict that and to try and say, no, you don't have to be poor to be like Jesus. You can be wealthy and be like Jesus too, which is true, but we don't need to create a myth to undo something that's wrong. We simply need to point to the truth of it. And the truth is, Jesus came the way he did to fulfill prophecies. He came the way he did to show an upside down kingdom. People expected him to come as a king with armies, with power, with riches, riding on a white horse. And he came in on a donkey. And he came in born in a manger. And he came in as a servant of all. He wasn't what people expected. And the financial status is not the thing about Jesus that we need to try and replicate. The thing about Jesus we need to try and replicate is our deep trust in God's provision and our deep desire to obey him no matter what, and our deep dependence on our Father. And that means fully depending on him to manage riches well, as much as it means fully depending on him to provide when it feels like we have nothing. The financial status is not the point, and it's never the point of the gospel. That's why I think it's dangerous to create myths that are really dependent on speculation. I think it takes our eyes off of what needs to be focused on and tries to keep us focused on things that obviously the Gospels didn't care much about. I realized that was just a real quick overview of Jesus being a millionaire. I am just going to leave this one at plausible because it is entirely speculation whether he was poor or whether he was rich. We don't know. It's plausible. It can't be confirmed or busted because we just don't have straightforward facts about it. But I think it is worth thinking through and understanding where it came from, why it's here, why it spreads. Because the truth of the matter is there are people that live with a poverty mindset that need to know if you had to be poor to be righteous, then Abraham wouldn't be righteous and Job wouldn't be righteous and no one wealthy would get into heaven, but all things are possible with the Lord. Hopefully that kind of explains some stuff. If you have any more questions, go check out my blog. And yeah, I'll put a couple other resources in the show notes for you. But until next week.